I think we're good to go. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Friday edition of Walking Through History. It is great to have you with us today. Thankfully, the weather has calmed down a bit. About an hour or so ago, the wind was whipping and the electricity actually went out here at the building. And I was slightly worried, hoping that it would come on before too long so we can make sure that we get our study in for today. And thankfully, it's come back on. And like I said, the weather has calmed down. The trees are not bending over like they were just a bit ago. So I think we're good to go and set to continue our study through the book of Genesis, walking through the history of God and his people, and continuing through this story of the sons of Jacob. The way I have framed these studies up until this point, I've been talking about journeys of certain individuals. We've talked about the journey of Abraham, the journey of Isaac, the journey of Jacob, and we might be tempted at this point to transition into the journey of Joseph. But instead of doing so, I think that Nathan Ward makes a great point in his writing on Genesis. And instead of this being the journey of Joseph, this is probably more akin to the Toldots or the generations of Jacob. Not the journey of Jacob per se, but the journey of Jacob's family. We often focus on Joseph as being the key central piece in this remainder section of Genesis. And while he does play a key role in the remainder of Genesis, we need to recognize that though he is often the focal point, he's not the main point. He himself, being Joseph, is not going to be the one through whom the generations of Jacob are going to continue, which is why we find ourselves in Genesis 38. And we have this seemingly on the surface, this random story concerning concerning Judah and Tamar. And as we look through this text this afternoon, as we look through this text of Genesis 38, hopefully we'll be able to see, maybe come to understand a little better why it is that this particular chapter is present within the text. And here along with me to help us dissect this text and to come to understand it a bit better is my good friend Alan Sienestrang. We're so happy to have him with us this afternoon. Alan, how are you doing? Thanks for being here.
Oh, doing good. I'm like you. I was watching that wind whip around my shade sail here and hoping it wouldn't fly away and all the rest of the stuff in the backyard. So I'm glad it's passed and we're ready to go.
Yep, we are good to go here at the church house as well. Excited to get into this text and come to understand it a bit better. Thank you for all of those who are joining in on Facebook. I have a lot of people letting us know that they are watching. Thank you for joining in this afternoon. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop those in the comment section. We'll both be monitoring that and addressing anything that comes up. And if you do have any questions, comments, please feel free to drop those in. Again, thank you for being here. If you have a Bible in front of you, you can join me in Genesis 38, or you can just follow along on the screen as the text will be up on the screen throughout our study. Let's begin reading in the text here right after I catch us up on where we've been. Reminder that we have gotten up to this point where Joseph is introduced as one of the main characters, as I said, not maybe the main character, not the focal point, but certainly a very important figure here in Genesis. And Genesis 37 introduces us to Joseph as a person. He seems to, he is the favorite of his father Jacob. And it seems then, I think that's more appropriate, that maybe this favoritism goes a little bit to his head, we might say, concerning these dreams that he has in verses 5 and verses 9 as well. He has two dreams, both of which show him being superior to his brothers, and in the second dream showing him being superior to his brothers, his father, and one of his father's wives. Jacob sends him out to go check on his brothers, which is something that apparently has happened before. He brings back a bad report in Genesis 37 in verse 2 of his brothers. Jacob sends them out to go check on them. He ends up finding them in Dothan. His brothers are ready to get rid of this younger brother who is getting the big head, and they come up with a plan. The first they said, we're going to kill him. We're going to kill him and throw him in the pit. We're going to bury him. And then Reuben comes and says, no, we better not do that. That wouldn't be good. Of course, his ulterior motive is for him to be able to raised back up to the position of the favored son. He was the firstborn that was culturally due him, but Joseph had certainly taken that position. He says, let's not kill him. Eventually, Judah has the idea, we're not going to kill him, but we're going to throw him in the pit, and eventually we're just going to sell him. We're going to sell him off to these traders who are coming through the area, and they do that. And we finish in verse number 36 of chapter 37, that the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guards. And we might think that reading through this narrative, we would pick back up right with Joseph. But that actually picks back up in verse number 1 of chapter 39. So chapter 37 and verse 36, we find him in Potiphar's house. Then it isn't until chapter 39 and verse 1 we find him in Potiphar's house again. Sandwiched in between these two chapters is this story of Judah. Judah played a pivotal role in what happened to Joseph in chapter 37. And now we're going to see what happens in his life in chapter 38. Before we read the text, Alan, help our audience to kind of get the chronology of this chapter down a little bit, because it does seem to be kind of awkwardly placed. It seems that some time has passed, and that some time passes, and we do end up reading about Judah again later on in chapter 44, especially. He shows back up on the scene, playing another big role. But help the audience maybe understand a little bit about the chronology here.
We know a little bit just because of the ages that we see Joseph. We see that in chapter 37, he was 17 years old. And we know, looking forward a little bit, when the family comes down to Egypt, of course, that's after the brothers have gone down. That's after the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. All of that happens over the next couple chapters, from chapter 37 to when the family returns, is about 22 years. So what happens in 38 is definitely a long period of time, because we're going to see that Judah gets married. He has 3 sons, all the stuff that happens with Tamar, and the 2 sons get killed. And then he eventually has 2 more sons. Well, all of that has to take place at least before the family moves down to Egypt. So we've got kind of a hard wall there. So from the time of chapter 37 to that time is 22 years. That would be enough time, assuming that each of these boys is getting married at 14, 15 years old, which wouldn't be uncommon then. To us, that doesn't seem like enough time for all 3 of these boys and 2 of them to get married and have, and everything that has to happen in this chapter. That wouldn't seem like enough time. But assuming that they do get married at a young age and are given to Tamar at a young age, then there's enough time. But it's not necessary. I think some of this could have happened. Maybe Judah could have already been married and had the 3 boys already in chapter 37 when they sell Joseph down to Egypt. So that's possible. It doesn't necessarily require that this happens in chronological order. And clearly, when we go to 39, we're jumping back to Joseph. So all the Joseph story takes place simultaneously with chapter 38. But I think it's a good place to put it here because of all of the ties and the connections between what happens previously up until 37 and then what also happens in chapter 39 as well. I think we'll see one of the reasons we have this story of Judah is as a pair with Joseph. And pretty much from here on out in Genesis, there's lots of groups of 2. So we have 2 dreams already in chapter 37. Joseph had the 2 dreams with the sun and moon and the stars and the sheaves bowing down. And later on, Pharaoh is going to have 2 dreams. And we have the 2 dreams that Joseph interprets for the baker and the butler. And even up until now, we've had a lot of 2s. We've had Esau and Jacob. We've had Sarah and Hagar. We've had Cain and Abel. I mean, we've had so many pairs of people that play off each other in a literary sense. So I think that's what's happening with Judah here. He's supposed to be compared with Joseph over these couple chapters, and as we'll see, I think there's so many similarities between these two stories, and also it highlights the differences too, the actions and the morality of Judah versus the actions and morality of Joseph are almost completely opposite. And I think that's the point. It's supposed to highlight Joseph as a more righteous person, but also highlight Judah as kind of a jerk here. He's kind of wicked, but we'll see that Judah's story arc and his rise to where he ends up is, I think more important for us. It fits in with the rest of Genesis. I mean, that's how Abraham was, ups and downs. Isaac, Jacob, all of them had bad moments and good moments. Well, Judah's going to be no different, and that's why I think he's pretty important to the story.
Yeah, pretty important. Might be a bit of an underselling of him, considering that what the people that are going to be found in this text, two names are actually going to be found in the genealogy of Jesus in the New Testament, one being Tamar and the second being her son, Perez. So that obviously shows the importance of what's going on here. And I think about, as we're looking at this story of Joseph and the inner workings between him and his brothers and his father, of course, we often focus on Joseph as the main character, but in a sense, he might be a supporting character so far as he is helping to make sure that his family is supported so they continue on. Particularly, Judah is able to continue on, and his family is going to be provided for so that the generations of Judah can continue and the Christ can eventually come through him. Well, Alan, let's look at the textual passage. Let's read the first 5 verses together, just kind of set the scene for the family of Judah, and then we will read about what takes place between his sons and the woman Tamar. We read in Genesis 30 and verse 1, at that time, which seems to be following the events of chapter 37, more than likely, at least to me. At that time, Judah left his brothers and settled near an Adullamite named Hira. There, Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. He took her as a wife. She's nameless here, but he took her as a wife and slept with her. She conceived and gave birth to a son, and he named him She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and named him Onan. She gave birth to another son, and named him Shelah. It was at Chezib that she gave birth to him. Here is the family of Judah. He leaves the family of Jacob. He leaves his brothers, it seems, and it says that he settled near an Adullamite named Hira. This is kind of a very random figure here within the story. He plays a part a couple of times, but we just don't really know much about this man named Hira. And yet he leaves his brothers, and he goes from a place, Alan, where he was really, if we go back to chapter 37 in verse number 26, Judah is the one that kind of takes the lead here in what takes place with Joseph. Yet following this, it seems, he almost falls from that leadership position and leaves and goes and he marries a Canaanite woman, the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. This, of course, would have been going against the desires that we have seen throughout the family of Abraham, that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were all ended up taking wives apart from the Canaanite women. They intermarried within their own family. And yet we see here Judah going against that and marrying this woman and having 3 sons, again, Onan, and Shelah. And of course, what is custom, Alan, is for these sons to be married off. And we see that beginning in verse 6. Do you have any further insight you want to throw in here concerning Judah?
I want to highlight verse 1. In the CSB, it just says that Judah left his brothers. I think several translations say that Judah went down from his brothers. And I think that "went down" phrase is something that's key. Uh, we see it several times throughout scriptures, talking about going down to Egypt. I've been reading Jonah lately, and several times in the book of Jonah, he's constantly at the beginning. He's always going down somewhere, down to Joppa, down into a boat, down into the depths of the ocean, down into the belly of a fish. I, it's too repetitive for it not to mean something. And usually, when we're talking about going down, um, think about it. Whenever they talk about leaving Jerusalem later on in the Bible, or going into Jerusalem, it's always going up into Jerusalem or going down away from Jerusalem. I think the point is more than just a geographical feature. I think it's a literary feature to kind of highlight leaving where you're supposed to be, or going away from where they're supposed to be, or going away from God. So I think that if that's true, then that really highlights what Judah's motivation is here and what his spiritual state is. He's leaving the family, leaving the family of promise, leaving his father's house, going down away from the presence of God in a sense. And notice what he does when he's there. I mean, he marries off a Canaanite, one of these wicked Canaanites that they were not supposed to be marrying with, and as we see throughout the rest of this chapter, I mean, bad things are going to happen to him when he's away, when he is down apart from God. And it's only when he returns to his family and returns to the faith, if you will, that things start to get better, and he starts to get out of this valley of his life.
Right. It is certainly key to recognize that literary device of going down. He went down. What you're saying here is we're seeing a descent in the life of Judah. It's a descent from not just a descent in direction. He probably did head south, but it's also a descent in status, that he's going from being this leader per se among his brothers. Now he's abandoning them altogether, and spiritually too, marrying a woman outside of the family that of course would be associated with paganism and such. And we're going to see that what ends up happening with his family is things just kind of go downhill with them as well. Beginning in verse number 6 of Genesis 38, we read that Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Again, that's customary. And her name was Tamar. I want to notice here that she's not referred to as a Canaanite. It could be assumed that this is the case, being away from the family, or it could be contrasting her with the Canaanite woman that Judah married. Maybe this was someone from within the family of Abraham. We just don't know for certain. Well, we do read in verse number 7 that Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. And then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and produce offspring for your brother. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But Onan, verse number 9, knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he released his semen on the ground so that he would not produce offspring for his brother. What he did was evil in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he might die too, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. A bizarre story here, Alan, a bizarre portion within this text, and it's actually not something that is completely unique in the Bible. In fact, we go to the New Testament and see a number of times where this sort of situation is talked about. Think about the Sadducees asking Jesus concerning, okay, well, we have this brother and his wife. The brother dies, his brother marries the wife. He dies, the next brother marries the wife. Then he dies, the next brother marries the wife. And the whole question is leading up to whose husband is going to be hers in the judgment? Who knows? And it's just kind of a silly question, messing with Jesus, or at least attempting to mess with Jesus. But we see here a real life instance of this cultural staple being present and being carried out within this family. I want you to tell us a little bit about what exactly is going on here, particularly with the whole part about performing your duty as her brother-in-law and producing offspring for your brother.
Probably the most famous example of this is going to be with Ruth, talking about the Redeemer. That would have been when a woman is widowed, then the next of kin, usually a brother, or if not a brother, we see like with Boaz and Ruth, just the closest relative. They would have been their duty and responsibility to marry her. Part of this is just for the sake of the woman. I mean, to be a widow would have been a very, would have put you in the bottom rung of society in terms of wealth. I mean, you'd had nothing. You have no husband or man to provide for you. So, I mean, we see that throughout the Bible. The widows, the poor widows, were always just barely scraping by. So this rule was a kindness for widows to be able to be supported. But the problem and the negative with this law was that the Redeemer, Boaz, or in this sense, or in this story, would have been, was the first one, so Onan was the second one. The point was to provide an heir, provide a son, and that son would have been the heir to the deceased brother. Right. So in this case, Onan, if he had a son with Tamar, well, that son wouldn't have been his. It would have basically been Er's in that sense. And then he would be kind of sacrificing his status as firstborn. With dying, then who is the new firstborn? Who is the head or the next head of the household? Well, that would be Onan. Right. But by providing a son through Tamar, then that son would take his place and become the recipient of that line, and it would bypass Onan. So it was a sacrifice in that sense, and that's why we see in the story of Ruth, the first person, there was a closer relative, and he's happy to let Boaz marry Ruth instead because it would have messed up his inheritance. Well, here Onan does something. Onan does it even worse. He's happy to sleep with Tamar and enjoy that part of the marriage relationship, but clearly he doesn't want to raise a son with her. And I mean, this was even more wicked. At least the man in Ruth, said, "Hey, you can have her, Boaz. That's fine. I'll pass that on to you." He doesn't try to just sleep with her and enjoy that part too. So Onan is clearly in the wrong and clearly wicked here, and he pays the price for it.
Right. The whole reason somebody might be reading this for the first time and they're thinking, what is this whole thing about brothers taking on the wife of a brother that's passed on to us? That's very foreign. That's nothing that, at least as far as I know, has ever been practiced within our society. But this being a Near East culture, the name of a family, there's much honor associated with that. Therefore, it would be dishonorable for the firstborn to not have any children and not being able to pass along his name. So in this culture, then there is this whole idea, and the word for it is levirate marriage. And it's interesting to me that this practice of levirate marriage, if a brother dies, the next brother takes on the wife, supports her, and then the first child, belongs to the deceased brother. This is actually adopted within the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 25 and verses 5 and 6. You can read about the Lord including this within the statutes for the children of Israel. And as you mentioned, also Ruth 1 shows this being carried out. But here, Onan's he's just jealous, and he is selfish. Actually, would be the more appropriate word. He's selfish. He does not want to bring into the world a son that by blood would be his, but yet in status and culturally would belong to his brother. He would be giving up the birthright. He'd be giving up the blessing. He'd be giving up everything if he was to have this child. And this selfishness, the Lord shows in verse number 10, was evil in his sight. And he also is killed because of it. So let's notice at this point, Alan, that both of the two sons, that two out of the three sons, the first two sons that have been given to Judah are both wicked. We do not know exactly the wickedness of we don't know what he did that was wicked, but the text just clearly says that he was evil in the Lord's sight. One translation said that erred in the Lord's sight, which is kind of a play on the name there. And for that he was killed. Here we see Onan was a selfish man, was not willing to honor the customs of the day, which God obviously approved of, and for that he was put to death. And if you're thinking about it from the outside pointing in, and maybe you probably don't know about the wickedness of you don't know about the selfish intent of Onan. If you're looking at it from Judah's perspective, you're thinking, this Tamar woman, she's bad news. she is what might be referred to as a black widow wife. That was a term used for a woman many years ago who killed multiple husbands, and she named the Black Widow. But that's the idea here, that anybody who's married to this woman, he dies. So of course Judah, thinking, I only have one son left, I don't want to put this son with this woman because odds are he's going to die too. Again, it might be the same kind of a little bit humor that you see in the story in the New Testament. This one woman's married to these 7 brothers and they all keep dying. You would think somebody, at least brother 3, 4, 5, would be thinking, I don't know if I want to be with this woman. She's bad luck. But so Judah comes up with this idea. He's thinking, okay, this is what we're going to do. Instead of me just giving straight up Shelah to this woman, he says, why don't you go and stay in your father's house and wait for this youngest son to grow up so that he can then marry you. That's what he says. But his intent is different. Well, the text tells us at the end of verse number 11, for he said, until my son grows up, but he thought he might die too like his brothers. So Tamar went to live with live in her father's house. And notice that what we're going to see later on in verse number, verse number 14. Verse number 14, that we're going to see that what transpires after this all comes about because Shelah had grown up, but she had not been given to him as a wife. So there is the true intent of what Judah is doing. He's just trying to get rid of Tamar and promise a son, but never actually give a son. So let's pick up reading then verse number 12.
Real quick, Nick, I just want to highlight, remember, we've talked about Judah. Judah is the main character here. And I want to see, you can see in this text just how far he's fallen. We talk about this wicked who is, he was so evil, he's just put to death by the Lord. And then same with Onan, he does something evil, he's put to death. It's not too often that the Lord just strikes someone down. So must have been pretty wicked for the Lord to just strike him down. And even Onan, we at least know the reason why he's struck down. But notice, Judah doesn't understand why those two are dead. He just thinks that it's bad luck. Tamar is just this black widow, like you mentioned. He assumes it's bad luck. So he has been so blinded by his own evil and wickedness and leaving his family that he doesn't recognize how wicked his sons are, and he just thinks it's Tamar's fault. And you see, you understand why they're wicked. And just each time that we're talking about a husband going into his wife, or it just seems like every time it's never that, they got married. In verse 2, Judah saw a Canaanite and he took her and slept with her. That doesn't sound like very much love there or anything righteous. That just sounds like, someone seeing something at the store and grabbing it and taking it. And same with Onan. I mean, he just there's you can just see in the context and in between the lines here just so much wickedness, especially sexual wickedness here. Even Onan, he went in, it says, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife. So this wasn't just a one-time thing that he did. He did this every time he slept with Tamar. So this was a repeated pattern that he did. And of course, Judah later on is, searching out prostitutes. And it would seem like this isn't just a one-time thing as well. This is a pattern, that something that he's done before, just because he knows the language and how to negotiate the process. So what we're seeing here is just a terrible family, especially in terms of sexual sins. And taking a step back, I think this really shines a light on the wickedness of Judah and his family, when in the next chapter we see the righteousness of Joseph and his unwillingness to sleep with Potiphar's wife, to the point where he's doing everything he can to run away from that temptation. So that's one of the big contrasts and highlights in this chapter, and Joseph, and why we have this chapter here too. But and we're not even done with it yet. We haven't seen all of the wickedness and the terrible things that will happen, but it's going to keep getting worse here with Judah.
Alan, that's great insight, recognizing the seemingly perpetual nature of a lot of what is going on in this text. That's a great thing to point out from verse number 9. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he did this. And every time, this wasn't just a one-off type of thing. This was a continual pattern of behavior. And it does seem that Judah's behavior is what leads Tamar to think that this plan that she's concocted is actually going to work out for her. And that plan we're going to see here in verse number 12. Great. Thank you for including that. Verse number 12, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And when Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite went to Timnah to his sheep shearers. Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear a sheep. So she took off her widow's clothes, veiled her face, covered herself, and sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. For she thought that though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. For she saw that though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. And when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her and said, come, let me sleep with you. For he did not know she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me for sleeping with me? He replied, I will send you a young goat from my flock. But she said, only if you leave something with me until you send it. What should I give you? He asked. Verse 18, she answered, your signet ring, your cord, and the staff in your hand. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. She got up and left, and then removed her veil and put on her widow's clothes, and then put her widow's clothes back on. And when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get back the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. He asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? There was no cult prostitute here, they answered. So the Adullamite, verse 22, returned to Judah, saying, I couldn't find her. And besides, the men of the place said, there has been no cult prostitute here. Judah replied, let her keep the items for herself. Otherwise, we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send this young goat, but couldn't find her. Again, a crazy story just gets even crazier here in this text, that Judah's wife, she passes away and he mourns for her, which again might add into kind of the sexual vulnerability he has at the moment. And once Tamar hears that he is going from where he is to Timnah to shear the sheep, she concocts his plan that she's going to get what culturally truly does rightfully belong to her. Alan, there's just so much in this text, and you've already mentioned the contrasting character of Joseph, what is famously known of in chapter 39 concerning Potiphar's wife and himself. We can contrast that with Judah here, and we just see the total opposite spectrum of the spectrum here, as far as
if you notice, Tamar hears that her father has gone up to Timnah, to the sheep shearers. Just a little cultural side note: this sheep shearing time was typically kind of like a big. Think of this as like a big party, like if you're going to Coachella or something like that. Some big, almost like a sexual orgy, I guess. And remember, they're with the Canaanites, so this isn't just the Judah and all his brothers. This is Canaanite party here. So this was already kind of a wild and crazy time, the sheep shearing time. But when Tamar hears that he's coming, she dresses up like a prostitute. She never even says anything. You notice it's Judah that saw her and came over to her and propositioned her. It's interesting if Judah was this, titan of infidelity and or of righteousness, and he never would have even thought about going into a prostitute before. Why would she think this would even work? Why would so it just tells me that this isn't something that Judah just did one time because he was mourning for his wife. I feel like this was something that probably happened every time they went up to the sheep shearers, or several times in his past. And he knows, just look at the language. He knows exactly what to say to her. There's no awkwardness with this transaction, which we see pretty clearly the whole dialogue of the transaction. What will you give me for sleeping with me? That type of thing. So he's done this before. This isn't anything new to him. And I think Tamar understood that. That's why she made sure that he ran into her in this way. Some other interesting kind of tidbits, just the items that he gives to her would have been pretty much the equivalent of giving someone like your passport and your social security card. These items would have been, especially the signet ring. The staff would have had markings on the staff that would have identified Judah or his family. Same with the cord as well. I think might have been like a cord with. This wasn't just like a random red rope or something. This was a kind of like a family cord. Might have had a crest or symbol on it. These were identifying items that would have been impossible for someone to or to forge or to deny that they're theirs. So which to me is going to tie in with Joseph pretty heavily, with his coat of many colors in the previous chapter, and then his cloak that Potiphar's wife ends up grabbing from him. I think it's the same type of item here, that this identifies who it belongs to, and it's kind of we'll see it's kind of a little comeuppance here, that in the previous chapter Judah gives Jacob Joseph's coat to identify if it's his, and then now in a minute Tamar is going to give Judah his identifying clothing or his identifying items as well. Again, we've talked about how much karma there is in Genesis. I think that's exactly what's going to happen here too. And then, of course, right at the end of your reading, the obvious result is that she gets pregnant, which that was the whole point of this. Tamar was under the custom and the laws, like she should have been given Sheila to try to continue the family, and she never was. So it's a little icky from our vantage point, but Tamar to me is if not the hero of the story, then we'll see that she is the most righteous one of anyone in this story, because she's her evil, I think, is forced upon her, whereas Judah and the rest of these characters are just wicked, and Tamar is at least trying to do what's right to the best that she can.
Ronnie, it is. If you're just reading the story for the first time, you're thinking, this is soap opera-esque again. This is just crazy type of behavior from these individuals. Why would Tamar go to such thing? If she if she is so seemingly unwanted by this family, why would she go to such great lengths in order to be able to produce another child in this family? And it goes all back to their cultural norms and the honor that was present within these cultures. We might not be able to understand that, but we have to appreciate it in a sense and try to understand as best we can in this text why she did what she did. And what's talking about it is exactly, at the end of the story, notice what Judah says. Verse 24, about 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, and these two verses, this verse here, 24, to me, just almost makes you laugh out loud, the hypocritical nature of it. But your daughter-in-law Tamar has been acting like a prostitute, and now she is pregnant. And Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned to death. And as she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message, I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belong. And she added, examine them, whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these. Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right or more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah and did not know her, and he did not know her intimately again. The time came for her to give birth. There were twins in her womb. And as she was given birth, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread around it, announcing, this one came out first. But when he pulled his hand back, but then he pulled his hand back, and out came his brother. And she said, well, what a breakout you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. And then his brother, who had the scarlet thread tied to his hand, came out, and his name was Zerah. So verse 24, Alan, Judah, again, just showing his lack of awareness, we might say, his lack of awareness for his own actions and the consequences of his actions. He dares to say, upon being told that Tamar has played the prostitute and is pregnant, obviously she's not been given off in marriage. She is reserved for this family. And if she has not been married into this family, Shayla's the one that she belongs to rightfully. And if she's pregnant, that means she's been with someone else. Well, Judah becomes indignant with that. So she needs to be burned to death. She needs to die for doing this horrible thing. And yet, who was it, Alan, that put her in this situation, which leads to realization later on in verse 26?
It's interesting, too, how much time Judah spent trying to get the goat back to the prostitute Tamar. He made this agreement with who he thought was a prostitute, and gives the signet ring and the cord and the staff as basically a surety, and until he could give her that goat. So he tries to send this goat to her. He can't find her. He's working pretty hard to make that deal right between those two and get pay her for what she's due. Yet he didn't do anything for actual Tamar, his daughter-in-law, when he should have given Shelah to her, and he never does. So those contrasting, he's willing to pay back the prostitute, but not his own daughter-in-law, and give her what's due. It's just pretty hypocritical. And verse 24, she acted like a prostitute. Well, you went into a prostitute. You're no less guilty than she is in that act. But of course, he's completely blinded to any of the wickedness that he's doing, at least until she shows the items that he left with her.
Yeah, this whole thing that he says, Judah recognized them. He knew exactly what it was: his signet ring, his cord, and the staff. And this statement, she is more in the right or more righteous than I. How can we understand that? I think there might be a couple of different ways. One might say, well, this is the kind of legal type of sense. She is more right in the sense that she was trying to accomplish what was necessary and what was appropriate. And though she had to do it in nefarious ways, she still fulfilled the legal obligation. Or it could be from more of a moral sense. She's more righteous than I. She did this one thing, but I need to think about all of my actions, how they led to forcing her to do these things. And maybe there's more overlap in those two understandings than we might recognize on the surface. But we cannot ignore the fact that Judah here, he realizes there's nothing I can do. There's no true recourse that I can have in this sense, because she only did what was supposed to happen. And even though I was duped in the process, what is. And I think it is interesting as well at the end of verse 26 that he did not know her intimately again, that he realized what took place. And though he could, I guess, in a sense, he could have taken her as a wife at that point, he didn't. He just let things be as they were. And that ends up resulting in the two sons that are born, twins again, which again is another echo from the story that we've been tracing in Abraham's family. Of course, the first set of twins was Esau and Jacob. And there are a couple of other parallels in this birth story with the birth of Esau and Jacob. What do you see here, Alan, to show some more similarities between those two events?
Well, real quick, I want to highlight that verse 26 again, because I think that's the key one here. We're talking about Judah. This is definitely a dip in his story arc, but I think the verse 26 is the crest of the valley, if you will, where he starts to redeem his character. Think about what's happened up until this point. I mean, he's clearly, I think, in a leadership role in his family. We don't know exactly to what level, but it'd be hard for him not to understand that he is basically the de facto firstborn. Later on, when Jacob, blesses all of the children, we see that Judah, I think, is the one that receives that blessing. Especially, I mean, it talks about him being the ruler, and we'll see. I think there's enough understanding from Jacob that this blessing also includes maybe the promise of the seed that would come through them. Obviously, leading toward Christ. They wouldn't have known about that, but that was important. That's why Isaac was preeminent over Ishmael, and Jacob would have understood a little bit of that because he received that over his brother Esau. So I feel like the point of this story is to show that Judah understood that, and he tried to give that away, just in almost the same way that Esau did. He leaves his family, he tries to separate himself from them. Notice how easily he gives his items of identification away. He could care less about his name and what and his importance. I mean, he's here, prostitute, have my name, have my ID, have my staff and my signet ring. Those were trivial to him, in again in the same way that Esau, the birthright was trivial to him. He sold it for a little bit of stew. So Judah, I think, is almost in the same way of that Esau character. But what he's seeing here, he's recognizing that despite all of that, despite his wickedness, despite his attempt to separate himself from the family and separate him from that responsibility as the firstborn role, the birthright, or the blessing, God's will was still done. And he sees that now that, Tamar, who was supposed to be given to his third son, and he tried to avoid that. Well, in a roundabout way, what was supposed to happen happened. So Tamar was given children, and through we'll see, and that's why we're told about the two boys through Perez. He is the one that the line of Judah, the line of David, all the way to Christ. It's through him that this line will continue. So I think it's at this point we don't really hear much about Judah, but clearly he returns to his family at some point later on, and he's a much better leader later on in the story. So I think this is his low point, and then his beginning of getting out of that valley of his wickedness in his life, and you see that right away. He did not know her intimately again. So contrast that with the rest of the story. They were sleeping around willy-nilly with whoever they want, and now that sounds a lot more like the character that is of Joseph we'll see next chapter, and the character that is a much better character of someone that, or much more likely for someone to have that character and in the line of Christ. But it was definitely a journey to get here for Judah to understand those important parts of the promises. And there's still more to go, but I think he comes to a better understanding even later.
And you might think, if you're just told something about Jesus being God in the flesh and living a perfect life and doing everything that God expects him to do, you might think, okay, if I wanted to imagine the family line that he would come through, well, surely for him to be that type of person, the lineage through which he would come must be pretty great as well. And yet what we see continually in this story is a number of very imperfect people, very flawed people, extremely flawed individuals who made some horrible mistakes. And sometimes they made mistake after mistake, and sometimes even the same sort of mistakes. They didn't learn, and they did not bring glory to God in their actions. And yet what we see and what we should recognize as being incredible about God is the fact that he still used them. He still used these people and even used their flaws. I mean, recognize that the flaws of Judah in this text led to Tamar doing what she did. And yet it is through Tamar, it's through Judah, it's through Tamar, it's through Perez, and later on through David, and then later on through Jesus, or later on that leads to Jesus. That is this lineage that is used. That's just incredible to me to see the power of God being able to work with flawed people to bring about his great purposes. And if we're just taking a moment to make considerations for ourselves, that ought to give us a little bit of hope, I think. I believe that should give us some hope to know that even though we're flawed, even though we make mistakes, that we are still useful in the kingdom of God, and that he can still use us to accomplish his purposes if we will simply trust in him and rely upon his grace and mercy, the strength that the Spirit provides, the guidance that the Spirit provides to be able to do great things in this life and bring glory to God. Alan, this is an incredible chapter, and seemingly it doesn't make any sense that it's number one here, and it doesn't make any sense that it would appear right here. But what we have seen through what you shared with us is that this shows us the descent of Judah, to show just how bad it can, where he is scraping the bottom of the barrel. And then as the story progresses, we see his rise back to a better place. And that's really going to climax in chapter 44 in verse 18, whenever it's Judah that is pleading for Benjamin, bearing his life. The brother who so quickly for profit was willing to give up the life of one of his brothers is now pleading for the life of another. We do see the transformation in the story of Judah here in this text. Just like we noted last time that we see a transformation in the story of Joseph, that Joseph doesn't start off as this great swell guy that we end up believing he is. It's a process. Process for Joseph, process for Judah. Guess what? It was a process for Jacob. It was a process for Isaac, a process for Abraham, and to keep the pattern going is a process for us as well. And that just shows the immense influence that God can have on lives whenever people trust in him. Alan, what closing thoughts do you have for us this afternoon?
Like we said, I think this is the key is going to be why this chapter was in here is because of Christ. It's interesting that it's not always the best character, the best moral characters that Christ comes through. You would think men like Moses or Joshua that we'll see, it'd be these people that, or Joseph, you'd think that would be the best one for him to come through, but it's not. It's guys like Judah, I mean, even men like David had great wicked flaws about them. But again, that doesn't matter. That's not God wasn't looking for the best person of each generation. The fact is that there was a promise, and that the promise was that through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And we see that promise given to Isaac, that promise given to Jacob, and we'll see. I think that line, not in the same way that the first three, but that line, that promise will continue through Joseph, and that's the story of the Bible. That's why his family, this Judah, the family of Judah, will become preeminent in Israel because of its future and the promises that the Christ would come through that family, especially when it's told to David that it would be, his kingdom would last forever. So it's important to know the origins. We didn't get a chance to kind of compare some of the connections with Judah and David in this chapter. Just a lot of if you notice, go back and look at some of the names that are mentioned in this chapter, like Tamar, where there's another Tamar in the Bible, and that has to do with David. And Shua, I mean, that's a kind of an iteration of Sheba. Well, Bathsheba was, there's some similarities in those names and others. So there's definitely, I think, some echoes when the writers were putting together the story of David. They were considering this chapter in their minds as well to make the connection between the two characters. Of course, their connection was actual in the fact that Judah is the great grandfather of David. So it makes him important and makes that promise, the seed promise, all the more important. We see that some of those promises are starting to be fulfilled. I mean, Israel is becoming they've already been blessed. They're starting to expand. They're starting to grow. We're seeing the beginnings of those promises as well, but they're still waiting for that seed promise. And we know that that's going to come much later, but we're seeing that God is guiding. His hand is over everything as the journey continues.
Right, through the many twists and turns, the crazy stories, God's purposes are going to be accomplished. Of that we can be most certain. Alan, thank you so much for your great comments and teaching this afternoon. I know that I have benefited greatly from hearing you explain certain things within this text, and I'm sure our audience can see the same. We're thankful that you have joined us this afternoon as we've looked through the story of Judah and Tamar here in Genesis 38. I hope that we've been able to draw some connections, not just within this text, but from this text to other texts, and we've hopefully explained why we believe that this text is exactly where it ought to be, and the reasoning why it is included within the story of Genesis. I hope that you'll join us on Tuesday as we continue to walk through history, walk through the story of Genesis, as we get back to what is often seen as the main storyline, being that of Joseph. We see in chapter 37, verse 36, that the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt, or sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guards. And chapter 39 and verse 1 says that Joseph had been taken to Egypt, and an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. That's where we're going to pick up in our study this upcoming Tuesday at 3 p.m. We invite you to join us then. And this Sunday, if you need a place to worship, we're going to be worshiping together at 10 a.m. Sunday here at 384 Pleasant Plains Road in Jackson, Tennessee. We'll be together for an hour of worship, and we'd love to have you join us if you are able to. We have a number of safety precautions put in place to accommodate those who might be with us. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out about that. The text or the lesson I'll be discussing, the idea of the lesson is living spiritually in a physical world. Our focus for the church here in Pleasant Plains in 2020 is living godly in an ungodly world, and we're showing how we can live differently than the world in various ways. Though this is a physical world, a material world, we are called to live spiritually and to think and to behave on a different level we're going to talk about what that looks like in the lives of spiritually minded Christians on Sunday morning. You're more than welcome to join us. And if you can't, we'll be live streaming that service right here on the Pleasant Plains page if you would like to join us in that way. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for studying with us. Hope that you maybe grasp the text a little bit better, because as we always say, we believe that knowing the Bible better enables us to have a stronger faith and a greater trust in God. Thank you all for being here. Take care. God bless. And we
Take
hope
care.